I've always believed that life doesn't warn you before it changes. It just knocks hard. And without apology. It was around 3:47 a.m. when I felt the cold water licking at my ankles. I sat up on the edge of my bed and for a moment, I truly thought I was dreaming. My feet touched the floor, and the carpet squelched beneath them. The air smelled like earth, metal, and dread. I remember stepping outside, barefoot, heart racing, and watching the current carry away the garden chairs I had bought last summer. They were a gift to myself after my 64th birthday. I had told myself they were just chairs, but now I stood frozen, watching pieces of my peace disappear. The house didn't stand a chance. Neither did the memories sealed in photo albums, or the quilt my grandmother stitched by hand, or the notebooks I had kept hidden in my nightstand. Gone. I called Elise. My daughter. 3 rings. Then her voice, light, carefree, with laughter in the background. Mom, we just got on the ship. Can I call you when we dock? I told her the house was gone, that everything I owned was underwater, that I had nowhere to go. There was a pause. Then she said, just sleep in your truck for now. We'll be back in a week. 2 maybe. And that was it. No follow-up. No, are you okay? No mention of coming back early. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside me had only just begun. I spent that first night in the truck, engine off, wrapped in a damp blanket, listening to the creaking of broken branches and the hum of distant generators. My stomach growled. My eyes stung. But mostly, I felt something I never thought I'd feel toward my own child. Distance. Not physical, emotional. As if the cord between us had quietly snapped somewhere over the years. And now, in the middle of a parking lot behind a gas station, I was realizing just how far apart we'd grown. But I didn't cry that night. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because part of me already knew. This was just the beginning. If this is your first time coming across one of our stories, welcome. Please hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't scroll away, because what happened next no one saw coming. The rain had started the night before, steady and soft like a whisper. I didn't think much of it. In fact, I made tea, folded some laundry, and even watered the plants on the windowsill, ironic considering what was coming. By morning, the whispers had become shouts. The wind howled through the trees, and the sky was the color of bruised steel. I turned on the local news. Flash flood warnings scrolled across the bottom of the screen, but it wasn't the first time our town had heard those. Most people stayed put, figuring it would pass. So did I. I'd lived in that house for over 30 years. Raised my daughter under its roof. Watched the seasons change through its windows. I trusted its walls. I shouldn't have. By noon, the water was rising so fast I could barely keep up. I threw what I could into a duffel, my medication, an old photo of Elise when she was 6, my late mother's rosary, a worn-out paperback I always said I'd finish someday. I grabbed my purse, my car keys, a pair of sneakers. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, water gurgling through every crack. Outside it was chaos. Neighbors yelling over the roar of the current. A man down the street clung to his porch railing trying to rescue his dog. I watched a woman wade waist-deep with a toddler on her shoulders, eyes wild with panic. No one was prepared. Not really. You think you'll know what to do in a crisis until it arrives, and then you realize how fragile everything is. I tried calling Elise. The line rang once, then cut off. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. I sent her a message. The house is flooding. I'm okay but leaving. Please call me. Minutes passed. Then a reply blinked onto my screen. Try to stay dry, Mom. We just boarded. Talk later. That was it. No, are you safe? No, where are you going? Just that. I stared at the message. I read it again. And again. Then I turned off the phone, stuffed it into my bag, and walked away from the only home I'd ever owned. The streets were no longer streets. They were rivers. My sneakers soaked through within seconds. I held my bag above my head and trudged forward, heart pounding. I passed the community center, the library, the church, all swallowed in brown water. I didn't see faces anymore. Just shapes. People moving through disaster in slow motion. No one stopped to help. No one saw me. I made it to the edge of town, to a gas station that sat just high enough above the floodplain. My truck was parked out back, where I always left it. The windows fogged, the paint chipped, the front seat littered with empty mint wrappers and receipts. I climbed in and slammed the door behind me. And that's where I stayed. Night fell fast. I curled into the seat, wrapped my soaked jacket around my shoulders, and listened to the storm tear through the world I once thought was solid. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't cry. I just stared at the windshield, watching the rain blur everything I had ever known into a smudge I couldn't recognize anymore. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and damp cloth. My phone buzzed once. It was a weather alert. I didn't bother opening it. There was nowhere else to go. No calls. No concern. Just a silence that weighed heavier than any floodwater could. Elise knew. She knew I had no place to go. And still, she boarded that ship. I tried not to think about where she was. The ocean breeze. The buffet dinners. The glow of a vacation I hadn't been invited to. I told myself she deserved it. That maybe I was overreacting. That maybe it wasn't about me. But the truth pressed against my chest with every passing hour. She had a choice. And she chose comfort over compassion. Distance over duty. Silence over love. In the darkness of that truck, as the flood raged outside, I began to understand something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. My daughter was no longer someone I recognized, and I wasn't sure she ever really saw me at all. I counted the first night in the truck by the number of times I turned the key just to feel the engine hum. Not to drive. Just to know something still worked. Something could still respond when I needed it to. The cold settled fast. Not the kind that just brushes your skin, but the kind that wraps around your spine and seeps into your bones. I curled up on the front seat, knees to my chest, coat zipped all the way up, and tried to sleep. I closed my eyes, but rest wouldn't come. Instead, I listened to the rattle of shopping carts being blown by the wind, the hum of the highway in the distance, and the occasional burst of laughter from people walking in and out of the gas station. Life moved on just a few feet away, but I wasn't part of it anymore. I was parked on the edge of the world I used to belong to. In the morning, I slipped into the convenience store, used the bathroom sink to splash my face, combed my hair with my fingers, and rinsed my mouth with a paper cup of warm tap water. I avoided the mirror. I didn't want to see the woman I'd become overnight. I bought a coffee I couldn't taste and sat in my truck with the windows rolled halfway down. My hands shook. Whether from the cold or the ache, I still don't know. Shame is quiet. It doesn't scream or wail. It just sits with you. In the passenger seat. In your reflection. In every polite smile from a stranger who doesn't ask where you slept last night. It lingers in the stale air and the crumpled receipts and the fact that you now measure your day in parking lots. It was on the second night that I reached into my purse to look for a tissue and felt something soft and torn beneath my fingers. I pulled out a water-damaged photograph, wrinkled and bent at the corners. Elise, maybe 7 years old. Front tooth missing. Braids crooked. We were sitting on the porch eating orange popsicles. I remember the day because she'd spilled hers on my skirt and cried for a full 10 minutes until I told her I liked the stain. That it looked like the sun had kissed my leg. She'd laughed and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would snap. I stared at the photo, tracing the edges like it could tell me where things had changed. When the warmth had drained from her voice. When I'd stopped being her safe place. Her father had left when she was 3. Just a note under the coffee machine that said he needed space. I never spoke ill of him to her. I figured she'd learn on her own what kind of man he was. I worked 2 jobs to keep her in school clothes and dance lessons. I skipped meals some nights so she wouldn't feel the weight of my wallet. And through it all, I told myself it was worth it. That one day she'd understand. But sitting there in that truck, with soggy memories and no keys to a home, I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, but deeply. I had poured everything into being her mother. Every ounce of energy, every dollar, every piece of who I was. But now, staring at that photo and remembering her voice on the phone, so casual, so distant, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to ask before. Was I ever truly her mother? Or just a placeholder for convenience? Maybe I was always just the person she leaned on when it was easy, when it was useful, when it came without cost. Maybe love, in her eyes, had an expiration date, and I'd missed the warning signs. I folded the photo and tucked it into the glove compartment. I didn't throw it away. but I couldn't keep holding it either. That night, I left the truck running for warmth until the gas needle blinked low. I lay awake watching headlights skim across the ceiling, listening to voices I couldn't place, and wondering how long a person could go before disappearing completely. No one called. No one came looking. I was alone. Utterly, quietly, unmistakably alone. It was 11 days before I heard from her again. I remember because I had counted each one. Not just to keep track of time but to hold on to anything that resembled structure. Her text came while I sat in the truck outside the laundromat, folding a pair of secondhand jeans I'd found at a church bin. Back in town. Lunch tomorrow. No question about how I was managing. Just an invitation wrapped in absence. I stared at the screen for a while before typing. Where? She sent the name of a bistro downtown, one of those places where sandwiches cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. I hesitated. I had no clean blouse, no makeup, no energy. But something in me, some flicker of old hope, told me to go. The next day, I arrived 10 minutes early and sat at the far end of the patio, tucking my frayed sleeves under my elbows. I watched young couples laugh over lattes and women in pressed suits scroll through their phones without looking up. Then I saw her. Elise. Tanned. Smiling. Wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my truck was worth. She walked toward me like nothing had happened, like I hadn't been sleeping in a parking lot while she danced on a cruise ship deck under island skies. Mom, she said, placing her purse down without hugging me. You look okay. I didn't respond. I didn't trust my voice. She ordered a salad with extra avocado, and told me how breathtaking the sunsets were, how Troy won a poker game on the ship, how they'd booked a second cruise, just to lock in the discount. I sat there nodding, listening, waiting for something. An acknowledgement. A sliver of concern. A flicker of guilt. But it never came. When the server placed a lukewarm bowl of soup in front of me, she smiled and said, I figured you might want something hot. I said thank you. She didn't look up. Then came the line I hadn't prepared for. We moved into a condo downtown. Gorgeous view. But it's small. Real small. Barely room for us, let alone guests. Guests. That's what I'd become. A guest in her story. A side character in a life I once centered my world around. Troy arrived halfway through the meal, kissed her cheek, and plopped down across from me like he was sliding into a meeting. Hey Carol, he said, nodding. Glad to see you're hanging in. You know, my dad always said you boomers had grit. I guess this whole truck situation is proof of that. Huh? I didn't answer. He smirked like he'd told a joke worth repeating. They spoke about renovations. The baby they were planning. The car they were thinking of upgrading. I listened as if I were eavesdropping on strangers. Then Elise reached into her purse and pulled out a folded paper. We wanted to give you something to help, just until you figure things out. She slid it across the table. A voucher. 3 nights at a roadside motel just off the freeway. A place I recognized from passing by, peeling paint, flickering sign, the kind of place people went when there were no other doors left to knock on. I stared at the slip, then at her face. She looked proud, like she'd handed me a scholarship or a key to something sacred. Troy clinked his glass against his water bottle. A roof and running water. Can't say we didn't help, right? I folded the voucher and placed it in my coat pocket. Thanks, I said quietly. She smiled and checked her watch. We've got to run. Meeting with our decorator. They stood, hugged each other. Then Elise leaned down and kissed my cheek, the way you do when you're being watched. Let us know if you need anything else, okay? But she didn't wait for an answer. I sat there long after they left. Soup cold. Wind picking up. Server waiting to clear the table. I didn't move. Because I finally understood. That wasn't lunch. That was closure. Not hers, mine. She wasn't reaching out. She was drawing a line. And I was no longer inside it. I didn't go to the church looking for God. I went looking for a bathroom I didn't have to explain myself to use. It sat on the corner of a quiet street, red bricked and softened by ivy, with a crooked sign that read Community Meal, Thursdays at 6. It was a Tuesday when I first pushed open the doors. Rain clung to my jacket, and my shoes left prints on the faded tile. No one looked twice. Inside, it smelled of lemon cleaner and old hymnals. There was warmth in the air, The kind that came not from thermostats but from people trying to offer something, however little, they still had. I sat in the last pew alone. Just me and the sound of an out-of-tune piano somewhere behind a closed door. I didn't pray. I didn't even close my eyes. I just sat, letting the stillness soak into me like sunlight after a long, gray season. That's where she found me. She wore orthopedic shoes and a knitted shawl the color of rust. Her voice was a mix of sandpaper and honey. She introduced herself as Dorothy, Miss Dorothy, to people who don't know me yet. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask what I'd lost. Instead, she said, "I hate sitting alone too," and plopped down beside me with the familiarity of someone who had once been invisible and decided not to let others feel the same. She told me she came every Tuesday to refill the coffee urns and water the ferns. Said the ferns talked back, and that's why she liked them. We sat in silence for a while, two strangers breathing the same air without expectation. The next time I showed up, she brought me a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a bottle of apple juice. She didn't wait for thanks. Just handed it over like it was normal. Like I belonged. By the third week I met Janelle. She had tight curls pulled into a bun and a clipboard that never left her side. A social worker, barely in her 30s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many people fall through cracks that were never supposed to exist. Ms. Dorothy introduced us with a wink and said, "She fixes people. Don't let that clipboard fool you." Janelle didn't fix me, but she listened. She nodded without interrupting. She asked questions gently, like she was opening a box marked fragile, and when I told her I was living in a truck behind a gas station, she didn't flinch. Just said, "Let's try something else." 2 weeks later, I was sleeping in a room with 4 walls that didn't shake when the wind blew. It was part of a women's housing program run by the church. Nothing fancy, 1 twin bed, a dresser, shared bathrooms, but it was clean, safe, and mine, even if just for a while. The first night I lay on that bed, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, whispering every name I could remember from my childhood. Somehow saying them made me feel real again, as if my past hadn't been entirely erased. Janelle gave me a spiral-bound notebook and said, "Don't think. Just write. Even if it's nonsense. Even if it's angry. Especially if it's angry." So I wrote. In the early hours before breakfast trays rolled down the hall. During quiet moments when the others went out for job searches. Sometimes in the dead of night, when guilt came knocking in the voice of my daughter, I wrote letters I never intended to send, to Elise, to Troy, to the version of myself that used to apologize for needing anything. At first the words came slowly, hesitant. Then like a dam had cracked they poured. Every memory, every silence that should have been a question, every thank you I never received, every apology I never got. Each page made me lighter, not happier, but stronger. Miss Dorothy would read some of them when I let her. She'd sip tea from her chipped floral mug and say, "You always did have a voice. You just forgot where you left it." One night, I helped her rearrange books in the church library. She moved slower now, arthritis winning most days, but she insisted on dusting the shelves herself. I asked her why she still came, why she gave so much when no one expected her to. She looked at me and said, "Because someone once did it for me. That's how we keep going. We pass on the kindness we almost didn't get." It wasn't loud, this chapter of my life. It didn't come with applause or grand epiphanies. But it was the first time I realized I didn't need permission to rebuild. I didn't need a daughter's blessing, or a family's validation, or even an apology from people who weren't sorry. I needed one thing, a choice. And I had finally made it. If no one was coming to save me, I would. Ms. Dorothy started moving slower around the 3rd week of December. It wasn't just the usual stiffness in her knees or the occasional pause between sentences. Her hands trembled when she held her mug, and she winced more often when bending down to water the plants she still claimed were better listeners than people. At first, she brushed it off with a joke, said her body was just catching up to her wisdom. But one morning, she didn't show up for the community pantry shift, and that had never happened before. I found her in her small apartment above the church office, sitting on the edge of her bed with her shoes still untied. Her breath was shallow, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at me with eyes that didn't need to speak much to be understood. From that day on I became her shadow. I picked up her prescriptions, sat with her during appointments, learned how to make her favorite stew just the way her mother used to, lots of celery, no carrots. She hated carrots. We'd sit together on her balcony in the late afternoons, bundled in mismatched blankets, watching the pigeons circle the old bell tower. She told stories I'd never heard before, about the man she almost married, the sister who stopped speaking to her over a necklace, the years she spent feeling invisible in her own home. Stories filled with both regret and defiance. She had lived many lives, most of them for other people. And still she found a way to leave room for me. One night, I read to her from the journal I'd been keeping. My hands shook as I turned each page, unsure if I was ready to hear my pain aloud, but she listened, eyes closed, a soft smile at the corners of her mouth. When I finished, she whispered, "You remind me of who I used to be, before I stopped fighting." 2 weeks later, she didn't wake up. The morning was quiet, no church bells, just stillness. I sat by her bed and held her hand until someone from the home care agency arrived. I didn't cry right away. Grief didn't hit me like a wave. It folded itself into me slowly, like a familiar coat I had worn too many times before. The funeral was small. Just a few church volunteers, Janelle, and me. I wore a black dress someone at the shelter lent me, and a pair of scuffed heels I'd found in a donation bin. I read a poem Dorothy had marked in one of her books. No one said much afterward. There wasn't anything left to say. A week passed. Then a letter came. Thick envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note in blue ink, shaky but unmistakably hers. "Carol, I don't believe in coincidence. I believe you were sent to remind me of the woman I once was. And in return, I want to remind you of the woman you still are. Don't ask why. Just accept it. You gave me dignity in my final days. Now it's my turn. The bank will explain the rest. Love always, Miss Dorothy." I read it 3 times before I noticed the second sheet. A statement from her attorney. She had left me $130,000. I remember sitting on the edge of my cot, letter in one hand, disbelief in the other. That number didn't feel real. Not to someone who had counted quarters for coffee and washed socks in bathroom sinks. But there it was. Her signature. Her gift. Her final act of faith. I didn't cry for the money. I cried because someone saw me as worthy of trust. Because someone who didn't owe me a thing chose me anyway. In that moment something shifted. The idea that love had to be earned, begged for, or biologically assigned began to unravel. Maybe blood isn't thicker than water. Maybe it's just louder. And maybe family is not always where you come from, but who shows up when you've got nothing left to give. Dorothy didn't leave behind a mansion, or a lineage, or a carefully curated legacy. She left something far rarer, the belief that broken things could still be valuable. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that too. It wasn't much to look at, the house on the edge of town. The front steps sagged like they'd given up holding anyone. Paint peeled in long strips like tired skin. And the backyard was a wilderness of thorns and broken glass. But when I stood at the edge of the driveway, keys in hand and sunlight catching the corners of the front window, it felt like possibility. Not grandeur. Just possibility. I didn't hire contractors. I couldn't stomach the thought of anyone else shaping this space before I got to know its bones. So I bought a second-hand toolbox from a retired welder down the street, watched hours of YouTube videos in the middle of the night, and taught myself how to fix what I once would have paid others to ignore. The plumbing nearly defeated me. So did the termites in the back closet. But I kept going. Not because I knew what I was doing, but because no one else was going to do it for me. And for the first time, that didn't feel sad. It felt empowering. Neighbors I had never met began to wave when they passed by. One offered a ladder. Another lent me a power drill. A teenager named Max mowed the yard after seeing me wrestle with the ancient rusted push mower. He didn't ask for money. Just said, "You remind me of my grandma. She was tough too." I painted the walls sunflower yellow and robin's egg blue. Not because they matched, but because they made me feel warm. Alive. I stenciled quotes on the bathroom mirror with a steady hand. "Still here." That's all it said. And it was enough. Night I baked. It started small: cinnamon muffins, old-fashioned cornbread, lemon bars from a recipe I scribbled on a receipt during a church potluck years ago. I snapped photos with my phone and started posting them online. Just for fun. Just to remind myself I was still good at something. And then strangers started commenting. A woman from Oregon said my banana bread reminded her of her late mother's. A college student in Maine asked if she could use my honey lavender scone recipe for her dorm bake sale. I called the blog warm crumbs because that's what I had. And somehow it was enough for people to come back week after week. One rainy afternoon, I opened the last moving box in the corner of the living room. I hadn't touched it in months, had barely remembered what was inside. But when I pulled back the lid, the scent of cedar and old fabric filled the air. There, folded carefully, was the memory quilt. I had stitched it years ago, when Elise was still in school, and life hadn't yet hardened her smile. Each square held a story. A scrap from her kindergarten dress, a corner from my apron, even a patch from the curtains that used to hang in her bedroom. Thread by thread, it was a map of the life I thought we'd always share. My hands trembled as I spread it across the bed. It didn't match the new paint or the second-hand furniture, but it belonged. It was proof that even things left behind could still matter. That something once torn could be made whole again, if only by different hands. And in that moment, sitting on the edge of a bed I built myself, surrounded by walls I painted with bruised knuckles and late-night music, I realized, this wasn't just a house. It was a resurrection of me. The call came on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished folding a batch of kitchen towels and was placing a new loaf of cranberry orange bread on the cooling rack when the screen lit up. Elise. Her name looked strange on my phone, familiar and foreign at the same time, like a word I used to know but hadn't spoken aloud in a long while. I stared at it for 2 full rings before answering. Her voice was breathy, too sweet, the kind of tone you'd use with a stranger whose favor you needed. "Hi, Mom," she said, stretching the words like taffy. "It's been, wow, way too long, huh?" I didn't reply. She filled the silence. "Listen, things have been rough. Troy was let go from his firm, and we're in a tight spot. The condo lease is up and well. Do you think maybe we could crash with you for a few weeks? Just until we land on our feet." Crash. That's the word she used. As if her arrival would be casual, temporary, uncomplicated. My mind ticked through the silence she had wrapped around me for nearly a year. The text after the flood. The motel voucher. The voicemail she never returned. And now, after the storm had passed and my world had slowly been rebuilt by the calluses on my hands and the prayers I whispered into lonely nights, now she remembered I existed. I cleared my throat. She jumped in too fast. "Of course we'll bring our own things. We won't get in the way. We just need a soft landing, you know? Family's supposed to be there when things fall apart." I almost laughed. Almost. But I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because despite everything, despite the cold truck nights, the pitying stares, the way she offered me charity wrapped in guilt, I was still her mother. I told myself I was just helping her the way I would help any stranger in need. That I'd learned how to create boundaries now. That the walls of my home would protect me this time. But as I hung up, something in my chest tightened. Not grief. Not anger. Something older. Something closer to resignation. The kind you feel when a wound is about to reopen, and you already know the scar will never look the same again. They didn't knock. The moving truck pulled into my driveway like it belonged there. Elise stepped out, cradling a bundle of pastel onesies in her arms. Troy hopped out of the passenger seat, swinging open the back of the truck, revealing more boxes than any temporary stay should require. A crib. A stroller. 2 plastic bins labeled pantry. A full-length mirror. Baby monitors. Diaper bags. A floor lamp. And hanging clothes. Lots of them. I stood at the screen door watching, heart sinking lower with every item that crossed my threshold. No small talk. Just movement and instructions. Elise brushed past me, sniffed the air and said, "Oh good, you don't burn those essential oils anymore." Then, as casually as asking for a cup of tea, she turned and said, "We figured we'd set up in the upstairs master. The extra space will help with the baby." I blinked. "The guest room has its own bath. It's just down the—" Troy interrupted. "Yeah, but that room's too small for the crib. The baby kicks a lot at night. Needs space." He said it like I'd forgotten how children worked. Like I hadn't raised Elise in a 1-bedroom apartment with no help, while working 2 jobs and hiding tears in bathroom stalls. I didn't reply. I simply stepped aside. Boxes thudded down the hall. Footsteps claimed the master suite I had painted in soft green, the room where I had once dreamed of peace after years of ache. That night, they sat at my table without asking. Troy opened my fridge and scoffed at the oat milk. Elise looked through my pantry and mumbled something about stocking up better. The next morning, as I folded laundry on the couch, Troy leaned over the stair rail and said, "Hey, since you're not working, we thought you could take the baby for a few hours while we go job hunting. Sound good?" "No, would you mind?" "No, thank you." Just expectation wrapped in entitlement. I nodded slowly, but inside something old and brittle cracked. I realized I wasn't their mother anymore. Not in the way that mattered. I was unpaid labor. I was an extra room. I was a backup plan. I was invisible. They didn't come home for dinner that night. Just a text, "We'll eat out. Don't wait up." I stood in my silent kitchen, the baby finally asleep in the bassinet Elise insisted I keep downstairs, and stared at the meal I'd prepared. 3 plates. 2 untouched. 1 woman standing alone again. Only this time, it was under a roof with her name on the deed, in a house she built from dust and bruises, now occupied by people who acted like she was the guest. I was wiping down the kitchen counter. The baby had finally gone down for a nap. Silence, for once, draped over the house like a blanket. I thought I might finally sit, just for a moment. Then I heard Elise's voice drift down from the upstairs hallway. She was on the phone. Careless. Comfortable. Laughing in that way she only ever did when she thought no one else could hear. "Yeah, we wore her down," she chuckled, light and triumphant. Of course she caved. She won't say no to her grandbaby. That guilt runs deep, like mother, like martyr. My spine stiffened. My hand paused mid-wipe over a ring of dried tea. I stood completely still, breath suspended. "She was always like this," Elise went on, her voice more distant now, moving toward the bedroom. "Acting tough, but soft when it counts. I mean, she doesn't even date. What else is she gonna do with all that free time?" The air turned to glass around me. Fragile. Sharp. Ready to cut. Every moment I had swallowed came back to choke me. The voicemail she never returned when I told her the flood had swallowed everything. The text, "Try to stay dry, Mom. We just boarded." The box of leftovers she pushed across the table, like a consolation prize. The motel voucher that smelled like cheap pity. Troy's jokes about budgeting. Elise's silence when he made them. The look on her face when she claimed my room like it was hers to take. A parade of small humiliations marching through my mind in single file. And now this. Not gratitude. Not respect. Just manipulation cloaked in baby powder and entitlement. She didn't see me. Not as a woman. Not as a mother. Not even as a person. To her, I was just the safety net she never planned to appreciate. A fallback plan. A quiet cushion for all her bad decisions. I sat down at the edge of the dining chair. My legs felt hollow. My hands were trembling. Not from rage, but from the weight of realization. This wasn't help. This was hostage-taking with a smile. And I had allowed it. But only until that moment. Because something shifted in me. Something quiet. But final. And though I didn't speak it out loud, the thought formed with clarity and fire. This house may have taken me time to build, but uninviting you will take less than a minute. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't slam a single door. I woke early the next morning, before anyone else stirred. The baby's soft breaths filtered through the walls, and Elise's muffled snores echoed from upstairs. The same roof we shared, but 2 entirely different worlds. I brewed coffee in silence. Strong black, no sugar, no softness. And then I changed everything. First stop, my lawyer's office. A man I hadn't spoken to in years, but who remembered my name, my voice, and the devastation of my house fire. "I need to revise my will," I told him. My tone didn't shake. My hands didn't falter. He raised an eyebrow when I told him who I was cutting out. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. He saw it in my eyes. I listed the women's shelter that had once given me clean sheets and a sliver of dignity. "When I pass," I said, "this house, every inch of it, goes to them." He smiled, surprised. "You sure?" "Absolutely." Paper after paper slid beneath my pen. My name, strong and deliberate, signed in blue ink. From there I drove to a home security store. Motion detectors, smart locks, cameras with night vision and cloud backups. I scheduled the installation for the following morning. The technician looked barely old enough to shave, but he worked fast and left no corner unprotected. I even added a new code, one no one but me could access. That evening I pulled every moving box they brought in and lined them neatly by the front door. No words taped to them. No notes. Just a quiet suggestion. A whisper without breath, "You don't live here." I didn't slam their bedroom door open. I didn't demand they come downstairs. I didn't need to. Let them notice the locks that no longer welcome their fingerprints. Let them feel the weight of the new boundaries written in silence, not ink. Upstairs, their voices danced in laughter. I could hear Troy making another joke about the price of almond milk. Elise was complaining about diaper brands. Meanwhile, I opened a fresh page in my journal. I used to believe silence was weakness, but now I know, it's power in disguise. I wasn't waiting for confrontation. I was preparing for resolution. And when they asked what changed, I'd simply say, I remembered who this house was built for. And it wasn't for people who only show up when they need to be carried. The air felt different that day. Thicker, still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. I was sitting by the window, a cup of lukewarm tea in my hands, when I heard the tires crunch into the gravel driveway. I didn't flinch. I'd rehearsed this moment too many times in my head. They got out of the car like they owned the place. Elise had a grocery bag in one hand. Troy cradled the baby in the other. They didn't knock. They walked up like people who assumed doors would always open for them. But this time they didn't. I heard the rattle, the click, the pause. "Mom." Elise's voice, high with confusion. "The lock, it's not working. Did something happen?" I waited a moment, then walked to the door. My steps were steady. My heart was not. I opened it, not wide, just enough to make a point. She looked startled, standing there in her oversized sunglasses and too thin patience. Troy was already irritated, shifting from foot to foot. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked again, more annoyed than concerned. I held her gaze. I didn't blink. "This house isn't your inheritance, Elise," I said quietly. "It was never meant to be." She opened her mouth, but I didn't give her space to interrupt. I reached behind the door and handed her the envelope. Inside, a copy of my revised will, notarized, stamped final. My name beside the name of the women's shelter that would one day stand taller, because I finally stood taller for myself. She took the envelope but didn't open it. Her face twitched, part disbelief, part growing rage. "Wait, are you, Mom, seriously? What is this? You can't be serious." Troy gave a sarcastic chuckle. "You're really kicking us out? What happened to family?" I nodded, but not the way they expected. Not in agreement. In finality. "I gave family every part of me," I said. "And you mistook it for an endless resource. You were never looking for a home. You were looking for someone to clean up your mess." The baby cooed. Innocent. Unaware. My chest ached, but not enough to sway me. "Where are we supposed to go?" Elise snapped. "That," I said gently, "is up to you. The same way where I slept all those months was up to me." She stepped forward, as if proximity might guilt me. "You're being cruel." "No," I said. "Cruel was letting your mother live in a truck while you took selfies on a cruise ship. This is called boundaries." Troy muttered something under his breath. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Instead, I looked at Elise one last time. The little girl I once carried in my arms was gone. And the woman standing before me, I didn't recognize her anymore. "Goodbye, Elise," I whispered. Not with anger. With peace. Then I closed the door. Not with force. Not with spite. Just gently. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed louder than any scream ever could. The first message came that same night. A barrage of text bubbles filled my screen like shrapnel. Fragments of a tantrum disguised as heartbreak. Elise poured out a cocktail of guilt, blame, and self-pity. "I can't believe you would do this to your own daughter. You don't even care about your granddaughter, do you? We're stranded, humiliated. How could you be so heartless?" She wrote as if she hadn't vanished for a year. As if I hadn't been left in a parking lot praying for warmth. As if she hadn't handed me a guest room in my own home. Her final text was just one word. Monster. I stared at the word until my tea turned cold. Then, without hesitation, I tapped block. And in that simple action, a quiet exhale left my body. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was release. For the first time in years, I stopped waiting for someone to love me right, and started loving the version of me who survived when no one showed up. My kitchen became my sanctuary again. I adjusted my apron, turned on the radio, and went back to kneading dough. My fingers dusted in flour, my heart no longer weighed down by expectation. The blog, originally just a digital diary for sourdough and cinnamon rolls, began to draw attention. Comments trickled in from women across the country. This reminds me of my grandmother's pie. I tried your banana bread, and my kids devoured it in minutes. Your story gave me courage to leave a toxic home. It was never about the recipes. It was the resilience tucked into every tablespoon, every story between the steps. Soon, I opened my doors again, but not to be used. This time, to uplift. Displaced women from the shelter came by on Saturdays. We rolled dough and talked through pain. I taught them how to pipe icing and how to breathe again. I showed them how to fold pastries and set boundaries. Some cried. Some laughed. All of them healed, one cupcake at a time. No one asked for proof of trauma. No one assumed I was strong enough just because I had survived. We were women remaking ourselves, with sugar, with fire, with silence. And in those classes, I realized something beautiful. What they took from me never broke me. It built me into someone no one could move again. The scent of ripe bananas and cinnamon wrapped around me like a familiar shawl. My kitchen window let in soft morning light, slanting over the cooling rack where golden loaves waited patiently. There was no noise, just the gentle hum of my oven and the quiet rhythm of a life I rebuilt with bare hands and borrowed strength. I didn't have riches. I didn't have applause. What I had was peace. And a house full of stories sealed into walls I painted myself. I sat down at the table, fingers still sticky with batter, and looked around. No moving boxes. No insults disguised as requests. No hollow apologies typed through gritted teeth. Just me, my ingredients, and the memory quilt folded neatly across the back of the chair. Stitched together in chapters of survival. I'd spent so long trying to be chosen, by a daughter, a husband, a family that treated love like a transaction. But here's what I finally learned, somewhere between heartbreak and banana bread. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the very ones who teach you how to stand alone. And standing alone isn't loneliness. It's clarity. It's power. It's choosing yourself after a lifetime of being chosen last. I smiled. Not the forced kind I used to wear around them. This one reached my eyes. This one was mine. So if you're listening, wondering if silence can be louder than shouting, if kindness can be sharper than revenge, let me tell you something I now know deep in my bones. You don't always need to burn bridges. Sometimes you just stop crossing them. And that was how I took back my power without raising my voice. If this ending gave you chills or left you speechless, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because my next story might just be even wilder. And please drop a comment below. I read every single one.